It didn't begin with anger or arguments. It began with something much quieter, a small misunderstanding that could have been corrected easily if someone had chosen to speak. Instead, everyone stayed silent. At first, I didn't notice the shift. People still smiled, still talked, still acted normal, but something underneath had changed. Conversations felt shorter, reactions felt delayed. I started sensing distance before I could explain it. I told myself I was imagining things. I believed clarity would come naturally. I believed someone would eventually explain what was wrong. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing was said. That silence slowly became an answer on its own. I watched people accept a version of events I never agreed to, not because they were sure, but because it was easier than asking. The hardest part wasn't being misunderstood. It was realizing how quickly silence could become permission for others to decide who I was without ever hearing my voice. I tried to remain calm. I told myself reacting too early would only make things worse. I believed dignity mattered more than defense. So I smiled when people looked uncertain around me. I spoke carefully. I avoided conflict. I thought patience would protect my reputation. What I didn't understand was that patience doesn't interrupt rumors. It doesn't correct assumptions whispered when you're not present. I noticed how uncertainty slowly turned into confidence in their tone. "I'm not sure" became "I heard that." I wanted to respond, but I didn't know what I was responding to. No one accused me directly. No one explained what they believed. I felt trapped, defending myself against something invisible. I realized how exhausting it is to argue with silence. It leaves you guessing which part of the story you're supposed to correct. And while I hesitated, the narrative grew stronger without me. What hurt the most was realizing some people knew the truth. They had been there. They had seen what actually happened. Yet, they chose to stay quiet. Not because they hated me, but because correcting the story would have been uncomfortable. It would have required admitting mistakes. It would have disrupted peace. So they let the blame settle where it already was, on me. I noticed the relief once responsibility shifted away from them. Tension disappeared from their faces. Conversations became easier again. I carried the weight so others didn't have to. That's when I understood silence isn't passive. It's a choice, a decision to let someone else absorb the consequences. I wasn't betrayed by lies. I was betrayed by people choosing convenience over fairness. And that realization stayed with me longer than any accusation ever could. Over time, repetition began affecting me. Even when you know something isn't true, hearing it implied again and again has weight. I started replaying events in my mind, questioning details I was once confident about. Maybe I should have explained differently. Maybe I should have spoken sooner. Self-doubt entered quietly. I felt defensive without defending anything, guilty without understanding why. I learned how easily confidence erodes when no one stands beside you. Support doesn't need words, but its absence speaks loudly. Every silence felt like confirmation, even when it wasn't. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I became cautious, measured, afraid of being misunderstood again. The story surrounding me felt stronger than the truth I carried inside. Blame doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it hides inside everyday behavior. It shows up in distance, not confrontation. No one cut me off openly. They simply stepped back. Slowly, politely, invitations stopped, conversations shortened, relationships faded without explanation. That subtle rejection hurt more than anger ever could. It made me feel replaceable, as if my version of events didn't matter enough to be heard. I wasn't fighting lies. I was fighting indifference. And indifference doesn't argue back. It just leaves you alone with unanswered questions. I realized how quietly someone can lose everything without a single argument taking place. I thought about speaking up many times. I rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined explaining everything calmly and clearly, but I also imagined the responses: polite nods, awkward pauses, doubt disguised as understanding. I realized once people accept a story, they don't want clarity. They want consistency. Correcting them would disrupt comfort. So I stayed quiet longer than I should have. Not because I was afraid, but because I was tired. Tired of proving something that shouldn't have needed proof. Tired of carrying responsibility for something I didn't create. Silence felt easier than resistance, even though it slowly cost me more than speaking ever would have. Eventually, the story began collapsing on its own, not all at once, but in fragments. Details didn't align, explanations changed, contradictions appeared. I noticed them before anyone acknowledged them. I stayed quiet, watching carefully. I understood forcing truth too early often backfires. Time exposed what arguments couldn't. When clarity finally surfaced, it wasn't dramatic. There were no apologies, no public corrections, just a subtle shift. People avoided the topic. Some pretended nothing had happened. Vindication arrived without acknowledgement. And that taught me something important. Being proven right doesn't always feel satisfying. Sometimes it just feels empty. What followed wasn't relief. It was distance. Distance from people who could have spoken, but didn't. Distance from relationships I believed were solid. I stopped expecting accountability from silence. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I learned that some people would rather move on quietly than admit they were wrong. That realization changed how I trusted, how I listened, how I watched people react when situations became uncomfortable. I became more observant, less forgiving of indifference. Silence no longer felt neutral to me. It felt revealing. I didn't come out of it stronger in the way people expect. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clearer. Clearer about who speaks when things get difficult. Clearer about who disappears. I stopped explaining myself to rooms that had already decided who I was. I stopped chasing validation. Growth didn't feel empowering. It felt quiet, intentional, protective. I learned to choose peace without surrendering truth, and that balance reshaped how I moved forward. Looking back, blame wasn't the hardest part. Silence was. The moments where someone could have spoken, but didn't. The pauses that allowed misunderstanding to settle permanently. I learned that truth doesn't always need enemies to fail. Sometimes it just needs comfort to survive. And that lesson stayed with me longer than the story itself. It changed how I see people, how I value honesty, how I recognize betrayal before it speaks. Silence taught me more than confrontation ever could.